Thank you everyone for joining. Welcome to this webinar of the Money Laundering Research Network. Today we will address the issue of using beneficial ownership data for large-scale risk assessment in public procurement. As you all know, beneficial ownership has been one of the central topic in the AML debate in recent years, especially thanks to the regulatory developments that we had in a number of countries. And here we are talking today about this topic in conjunction with another one, which is the transparency and integrity of public procurement. So presenters will be Irene Tello Arista from the Central European University, together with Mihály Fazekas from the Central European University and the Government Transparency Institute, and Antonina Volkotrub from the Anti-Corruption Action Center, which will present their working paper, which was shared in advance. And discussant will be Andres Knobel from the Tax Justice Network. So we have today main leading recognized experts on both beneficial ownership and public procurement in a clash of titans. So having said that, I leave the floor to Mishi and the team for presenting the paper, and then to Andres for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michele. I'm going to start. Yes, like Michele said, I'm Irene Tello Arista, and I'm doing a PhD at Central European University to see how we can use beneficial ownership data to understand better corruption networks and money laundering networks. So basically, I think it's important to start talking about the supply chains of the corruption schemes and supply chains of money laundering, which is something that we're going to start discussing. I think this is what we're going to cover here: the motivations, the conceptual framework, the data and the methods, the results, and then we start the discussion. So for the next slide, Mishi. I think, of course, beneficial ownership registers were created in many countries of Europe to try to prevent hiding who the real owners of companies are. But we know, at least I know from my experience in Mexico, that unfortunately companies are still being used not only for the corruption, but for the money laundering scheme. And these schemes sometimes are very national, when you have the same company doing the corruption scheme internally with the procurement processes in a country, but then you have the transnational anti-money laundering or the money laundering schemes that I think it's important to understand how these data sets could actually be matched to understand these patterns. So we wanted to do an analysis of if actually beneficial ownership data could be used for this. So what we are doing is validity testing theoretically and empirically some common indicators of ownership risks. So basically what we did is analyze the literature on what certain ownership risks are regarding our definition of corruption, some cases of corruption that have been tested, some literature, what some experts say that these are the risk indicators that we should be looking. And we also empirically tested these indicators to see if they have a correlation with another validated indicator of corruption in public procurement that Mishi is going to explain. So we are doing two types of validation in this test to try to understand if the quality of the data sets that we have of beneficial ownership can be used to actually detect corruption risks in a more general pattern. So basically, we want to understand the impact that this transparency policy has, not only in the crimes itself, but how we can use this data to identify corruption risks and money laundering risks. So I give the floor. This is the institutional framework. We are analyzing 6 different countries: Denmark, Estonia, Latvia, Slovakia, Ukraine, and the UK. Basically, we needed to have countries that had enough quality data for a period of time so we can do the risk validation of indicators. But we also needed countries that had similar kind of institutional backgrounds, but also to understand the differences, that they have differences in integrity, in transparency issues, in high corruption schemes. So I think these countries, as you can see, are a big, broad, well, they can show us different pictures, and this is the things that we're trying to test. So I think the next one, and I'll give the floor to you, Mishi.
Thanks a lot, Irene, and I also would like to thank for Michele and this network to have us. So quickly to unpack a little bit what Irene mentioned. So the logic we are trying to test here, or the mechanism or the relationship, is that if a company has risky beneficial ownership features, in principle, it should be more likely to engage in corruption and related crimes like fraud and others in public procurement. And that you can call it in methods language convergent validity, right? You look at wrongdoing from two different angles, the ownership side of things and the public procurement transactional, right? Public procurement is about tenders and awarding contracts, right? So these two sets of crimes should correlate with each other. We don't expect them to be fully aligned. For once, public procurement corruption can be done in all sorts of ways which have nothing to do with risky ownership structure. Now, there is also an important thing here that we don't expect corrupt politicians to put their addresses, their Cayman Island addresses, on a beneficial ownership register, right? So these registers have been created with the goal of transparency, but we don't think that corrupt politicians are naive or stupid. I mean, some are stupid actually, but probably most of them are not, right? So instead, what we expect far more is having some errors, missing values, outliers in the BO register, which point at attempts to circumvent transparency requirements or using nominees or some other brokers, right? So basically, we test a bunch of risk factors with the view that exactly the errors and the outliers and such will be indication of a risky ownership structure. So what exactly we are testing, and this table is the list the BO risk features which we could get from the literature and calculate in at least some of the countries for which we have data. One group of indicators relate to the features of the beneficial owner itself. And so the frequency of companies, the number of companies on the same name, the change of beneficial ownership information, so on and so forth. The second group of indicators relate to the location, the country of the BO. Foreign BO could be more risky simply because verifying foreigners is far harder, but also sanctioned or offshore jurisdiction related BOs could also be risky. And the final group, company age and BO politically exposed or politically connected BO, are those which are indicators which are already very validated, right? So we know from the literature that they work. We try to revalidate them using a different data set. Okay, so we have a range of things. It's not everything which the literature put forward, but a relatively wide range. So what kind of data do we have to do this? And sadly, this is a short slide, but this was about 80% of our work. So getting both public procurement and BO data and match them up in Denmark, Estonia, Latvia, Slovakia, Ukraine, and UK was pretty painful. The data covers an about 5 years period, and we try to be as comprehensive as possible. So if we go for the register, right, the full ownership register in the national or the open ownership version, and the full public procurement data set as gathered by my colleagues at the OpenTender.eu. The matching was not perfect. We used ID, company IDs whenever that was possible. When not, because there are a lot of records without company IDs in the procurement data, we did an approximate matching based on names. So here is the result. So you see the country years vary a little bit. The scale of the data varies as a starting point. Naturally, the UK and Ukraine have by far most data, both on the company and the procurement side, and also on the matched data side. We have Ukraine as the biggest country, but also some other countries have relatively big matched data sets. Importantly, we don't have 100% coverage. Okay, so even in Ukraine and Slovakia and Estonia, we get about 2/3, 3/4 of the data. Yeah, The rest of the procurement data, we don't have BO information, which might not be data error, right? So publicly listed companies win big in procurement because they are large. They often have big footprints in that market. So there, we often don't have BO data by default, so matching rate will be lower. Then there would be self-entrepreneurs and self-employed people. So, we don't expect 100%, but, 30% is probably an underestimation of how much data we should match. Looking at the corruption risk index, the set of red flags in the procurement transactions, we'll not go into detail. There have been many publications with this. These indicators have been separately validated against proven cases, against some statistical evidence. But the idea is that these red flags in procurement capture risky features of the tendering process and the contract award process. So there is like single bidding on otherwise competitive markets, or missing bidders, missing competition, the procedure type being non-open or direct awards or invitation-only tenders. And another example, the no call for tenders. So the tender is not started with open publication of a call for tender, rather just directly avoided. Now, the method is relatively straightforward. We look at linear correlations. I don't bore you with that. None of that works. Then we go on to fixed effects, linear regressions. Basically, within each country, we have the corruption risk index on the contract level. And then we have the various beneficial ownership indicators. We test them separately. And we have a bunch of control variables, which we know determine corruption risk levels, like contract value, year, location, type of the buyer, because central governments versus local governments have different regulatory frameworks. So we try to control for a large number of confounders. The relationships we find are not causal, they're correlational, but that's enough because that's the definition of convergent validity. So here are our results very briefly. You have the countries in the columns and the various indicators tested in the rows. The gray ones are the ones where we could not test the relationship because the BO data was not there, or it was largely missing from the procurement data. But there are quite a few green cells. These are the ones where we could find the relationships as we expected, and the no's, so the red ones, are the ones where we found the opposite or insignificant relationship. So if you look at, for example, company frequency by the BO, mostly, so whenever we could test, we found the hypothesized relationship. But what varies is exactly what are the outliers? What's the exact definition of the outliers? Is it 30 companies? Is it, 10, 20 companies on the names of the same BO? Interestingly, what we didn't expect, but still worked, is, for example, offshore jurisdictions. I really just thought, like, why would a BO at all declare that he or she is based in, the Bahamas or, some other nice tax haven? But they do declare this, and their companies are more risky, right? So in a few countries, this actually worked, even though in not all the countries. So just a very few examples of how we, fish for these thresholds, these definitions of red flags. What's an outlier? So this is an example of BO frequency from the UK. So we have like sort of normal, small, relatively small, and not too large number of companies on the name, 1 to 4, 5 to 8. So these are basically ranges of the BO frequency variable, which are normal in a sense that the associated risk factors in procurement, the CRI levels, are not distinguishable from 0. And then there's a jump in the case of the UK when 9 companies are on the same name. And then, of course, the effect is even stronger when you look at very large numbers, like 1,300 companies on the same name. So we applied similar logic to various different countries, and then different factors, like these are the number of BO changes in a year. 1 or 2 seems to be normal, and then we have 3 to 7. So really at the top of the distribution of BO changes then we have a jump in risk factors, so that you have a sense of the magnitudes of these, right? So these are not huge things. So 0.2, 0.15 would be one standard deviation. So these individual jumps would be of modest magnitude, but still they are significant and not irrelevant. We have far higher effects for no bio data. It's positive in all 4 countries where we tested it, but in Ukraine, it's by far the biggest. I must say that the matching quality is the highest in Ukraine in many respects, so I'm not surprised that the effect is relatively large compared to the other countries. Bio age, so that's an interesting thing, right? We thought like either very young owners or very old owners could be risky, could indicate a nominee. And in the case of Latvia, young and middle age, so between 39 and 70, you pick your definition, but so basically young and the bulk of the bio owners are not statistically different from the background CRI level, but then very old bios have higher risk factors. We are running out of time, so I'm jumping over these. There were some results on already validated indicators, like very young companies have been shown by many papers to be risky in public procurement. So this is reconfirmed with Danish data, and politically exposed persons where we could have this from other sources also have higher level of risks in Ukraine. So just quickly summarizing some of the main findings. So first of all, we think we have evidence for the not obvious statement that bio data sets are actually good enough quality to do some systematic large-scale risk assessment. So that's interesting, and it's reassuring given the policy and political capital spent on them. Some of their errors are actually useful, so that's cool that they are not that perfect. We also think that at least in some countries, in some formulation, the bio indicators put forward by the literature are actually valid for the procurement domain at least. Effect sizes are not huge, and then these numbers of affected cases are not huge, 5-10% of the sample, but definitely these things are there. And then finally, risk definitions are country specific, so we do need some tailoring of these indicators. What's the outlier of number of companies on the bio name or age in a particular country? These reflect country specific distributions, like the age distribution of bios is different by countries, but also regulatory differences. And we could suspect that some of the underlying corruption technologies might be also different by country. So let me close this. And I must say that we forgot to say this, that the research has been funded by the Open Society University Network. So we are grateful for their financial contribution. And the paper is shared and looking forward to the comments.
Thank you, Mishi. I immediately leave the floor to Andres Knobel for his reaction.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be a discussant. I found it really interesting. I really enjoyed the paper. And I feel like I really enjoy any case where people are actually using bio data. That was one concern. Many of us in the civil society were asking for more transparency, but then the question was, is anyone actually using it? I think it's also quite relevant to try to promote more the anti-corruption use. Of course, BO has always been related to anti-corruption and EATI and for procurement. But when we look at who really seems to be in power and who are the countries following, it seems that corruption is not really what triggers them. It's usually more either the tax administration for exchange of information or the FIU or the FATF for anti-money laundering. So many agree that BO is also relevant for corruption, but still many times anti-corruption agencies do not get access to these. So I think it's very welcoming to really show how this can be used for anti-corruption purposes as well. As a disclaimer, I work in policies, so I'm not going to talk too much about the results from the paper. I actually don't investigate or do that type of analysis. I wish I had the technical expertise and the time to do it. But my focus always is on the policy implications. Basically, what else could we be doing? And also, what do we need to change based on what you found? Really, I feel like I have many more questions than answers, so I will be maybe asking many questions. Maybe some of those you can then address or answer them, or maybe that can be part of the discussion with all the other experts that are here in this call. So first, I feel like most of my points is some ideas that I had by reading the paper on how this can be expanded in the future, but also just wanted to make sure that why some things haven't been done, and if that was a case of no time, or why that was discarded. If it was like I hadn't thought of that, or most likely there was no data, or for some reason it was not possible to use it. The first thing is, in a way, the way I personally always think of things is, what is the ideal scenario? What is the north? What would be the ideal case we would like to see? And then we can know what is missing, or what else we need to be asking for. So I was wondering whether you had thought of that, since especially you seem to have been working a lot on anti-corruption. So what other details would we love to have, or do we think we need to have to really properly address and find corruption? Is it the PEP status that you said, like maybe in Ukraine they had something, but in most of the countries they don't? Is it if it's a foreign or a local one? Is the tax identification number, which tends to be maybe the best case to match companies and BOs and companies with each other? I think you were using mostly the company incorporation number. Then one thing that I've been asking or hearing for people with more experience on corruption is this idea of having the BOs not just for the one who won the procurement contract, but also for all the bidders, at least to check if there is bid rigging or any other collusion between them. And then maybe one of the main things, I feel like there's a lot of agreement that one of the biggest challenges about BO is how to identify nominees. And so it seems, at least I personally think, that having the economic profile, most of which is supposed to be done by tax administrations, even if that's for tax evasion purposes, could also be used here to detect nominees. Basically, people have no income, no assets, but still appear owning companies involved in procurement, or simply companies with a lot of asset or income. Then also, based on the data that you did have, how could you think that could be improved? I mean, say that we could do some advocacy for countries, being like, I mean, what should we be asking even about the data that they already make available for you to use? Do we need more structured data, or what is it that we should ask for that? Historical data, I don't know, if an individual has been subject to discrepancy reporting, what else could we be doing that maybe was not, again, what are the policy asks that we should have or conclude after your research? Specifically on the paper and some of the things that you were measuring, I had some comments. So you were focusing a lot on year of incorporation of the company, and you were saying that can be, has proven to be relevant for as a corruption or high risk indication. I wonder what shelf companies have in this regard. I mean, is it that who uses shelf companies? I mean, because we're using a shelf company, it existed for many years, has a bank account, has people. So then you, in a way, circumvent the recent and early years. So is that something that you think can be addressed in any way? I wasn't sure if you had removed sole proprietorships, I think like from Ukraine. In a way, these would be the BOs. I mean, they're not technical BOs, they don't even have to register, but that's because the natural person shareholder is already the one in control. So I was wondering why not use those? I mean, of course, there's no secrecy there. The commercial register will tell you the data, but shouldn't we be doing checks on these people as well? The same with the case of listed companies. I understand that many of them, they don't have to disclose the BOs, but they might still provide some information on the stock exchange. So couldn't we be looking for that data? I think at some point you were also looking a lot into companies that hadn't disclosed a BO. Sometimes what we found, again, sometimes, and I feel like you reflected that can be legal. Like in the UK, you can legally have no BO. If no one passed the thresholds, there's no BO. But in many other cases, you have the senior manager. So our guess, and sometimes even talking to law firms that said like, oh, BO is so easy, just appoint the senior manager and that's it. I was like, no, that should be the residual case when you haven't found the real one. But isn't there maybe like a higher risk when we realize that the BO is there, has a name, has an address, but it's just a senior manager and not the real BO? I would have thought that was a bigger risk than even having no BO, which already is a quite obvious flag. Then you also said, part of the paper said, Estonia's procurement data set has almost all bidders' tax IDs, and in addition, well-structured beneficial ownership data. Do you know if Estonia then is better than anyone else in catching corruption or any other things? Like, basically, we all keep asking for structured data. Like, once a country has it, are they finding things, or is anyone using that or not? I mean, again, that was not part of your research, but I was wondering if you had been in touch with any of the authorities about whom you have done this assessment, and even if you had shared your results with them, just to check whether they agreed with you or if they're using any of that. Then one of the things that you were looking at is that the company, or you were proposing that the company is risky when the BO is not resident in the country of the tender. Now, for me, that could still be, and I think that you were even mostly looking at nationalities. I think it could also be relevant. I mean, you can be a foreigner who lives in the country. You can be like foreign direct investment. What I would think that is even riskier, and something that I personally disagree with, is the idea that the BO is also resident in the country where the tender is taking place, but the company is foreign. So say I'm in Argentina, the tender is in Argentina, but I use an LLC from Delaware. And the question is why? Why not use an Argentine company? So I was wondering whether, just again, not when the BO is a foreigner, but when the BO is a local, but the company is foreign, whether you thought or you had considered that being useful. And about like PEPs that you said, I think like only in Ukraine you had that, but doesn't the official gazette would have information for that could be used? I'm sure that might be super complex to then get it, but at least in many countries, ministers, secretaries, they are mentioned in the official gazette. So I feel like that could be one place to start getting that data. I mean, I think it would also have been useful for me to know what is the full list of data that is available, either from BO registries and for procurement, even if you haven't used that. Just to give the example that Transcrime had used, the gender of the person, the BO, which is sometimes given by the prefix, if it's Mr. or Mrs. And they had found this really interesting thing about mafia infiltration, that sometimes there's a higher proportion of women as owners, or it could be the daughters or the wives of the mafiosi. So again, gender through the prefix could be useful. So I was wondering whether you have this full list of other data and why you have maybe not used all of them, either if there was any reason for that. Then I know I'm running out of time, so I'm looking at my other notes and ideas to ask. Also, I feel like we focus a lot on BO, beneficial ownership, but what about the legal owner? I mean, if the legal owner is a natural person, couldn't we also maybe do those checks as well? Or shouldn't we try that, similar to the point where we're using sole proprietorships, where the LO is the BO? And also just checking, like, is there any change? Like, do we have any different indicators when the LO is a natural person compared to when it hits a BO? Like, are they both foreigners or residents? Again, if that data is also available, actually it's even available in more countries, LO data, couldn't that also be used as an anti-corruption effort? Also, the idea of complex ownership structures. I mean, I know also Transcrime has worked on that. I mean, I understand like you can be measuring how many layers are there up to the BO. Had you considered using that or not? I know I'm running out of time, so I guess I'm going to just jump to yeah, I guess the one was whether you had actually tested. I mean, you found these cases of someone that was owning, I think, like 9,000 companies. Did you check who that person was and what were the companies? Did you check if he was a billionaire or not? Or did you get any feedback from the authorities? Were you able to choose? Yeah, just basically find or discuss your results with them. Then one thing that I feel like sometimes after talking to authorities, even if they agree to disclose to me how their algorithms work, is should we be having an open discussion about that? I mean, aren't we also alerting criminals about what it is that they're doing? And then maybe they realize that they should no longer use these abnormal ages and they should find nominees who are like 50 years old instead of like 75 or 3. Or maybe they might stop using the same nominee twice or 100 times and they would simply ask for 1,000 nominees just to have one owning one company. So is there a risk when we openly start discussing like what are the indicators that we find to find corruption? And then maybe the last point, and this is maybe playing a bit of like David's advocate, is part of the discussion about like, again, my experience is on BO, not as much on procurement, is that there's a lot of investment, and sometimes people criticize having BO registers, and then there's a point that they don't really work. I mean, we have been having BO registers for many years now, even public access. It seems like corruption, money laundering, tax evasion hasn't really noticed much their existence. And part of it, at least our argument is that, well, they're not properly staffed, there's no verification, we can't really trust the data, so they don't really work because they're not properly doing it right. I mean, once it's effective, then it's going to be a different story. But so assume that that is correct, and then most of the data there is untruthful or inaccurate, like how Global Witness checked the UK's register. How much then can we actually be using the data? I mean, you were saying that even with the current state of affairs, BO data is pretty good enough to start finding these relationships and these possible indicators. But how then does that match with the idea that most of the data might not be true? Or the fact that it's so easy to circumvent. I mean, they still use these 25% thresholds. So, I mean, even if they're telling the truth, it's so easy to maybe remain hidden. So the data that is actually registered there, can we actually use it? I mean, do we know that it's working? And then maybe one of the last points is, I feel like the paper says that, and with so many anti-corruption experts here, maybe we can have that discussion. I feel like there's these two ideas. On the one hand, and maybe that's our approach, we think that corrupt officials are super sophisticated. They are the ones using this offshore discretionary trust or a purpose trust, and really, really sophisticated things. But then we also know, and being in Argentina, many cases where people are extremely unsophisticated and they leave the BO field blank and they don't put anyone there. Or as you're saying, maybe someone says that they are BO from North Korea. So who are the people who are super sophisticated and who are the ones who are corrupt but unsophisticated? Like, where do we find one or the other one? Because sometimes we find, like, for the really complex structures and all of these, because basically one of the things you were saying is that sometimes even the mistake itself, that can be an indication of corruption, I guess, suggesting that then that's a case of someone who is unsophisticated. I remember when I was in law school, there was this professor talking about bankruptcy law, and he was saying that there was this judge who was an expert in bankruptcy, and once he found this case where everything was just flawless. Every creditor who there had their credit, had like the sign, like there was no controversy, everything was flawless. And he said, after like 30 years of being a judge, I know that bankruptcy is super messy. So in this case where everything is flawless, I know it's fake because reality is never as perfect. So the point is that maybe the ones who are actually being successful as corrupt officials, they don't put like BO from North Korea, they don't put BO from Cayman Islands, and maybe they don't have anything, maybe they have someone who's 50 years old. So, I mean, does it make sense to be focusing on the mistakes and the obvious cases? Or who are these people? I guess that's maybe the main question that I have, how to distinguish between these two. Okay, I'm running out of time, but yeah, I guess I just had like many questions stemming from this paper. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Oh, thank you very much, Andres. All very good tips. I suggest maybe before leaving to Mishi and the other beneficial owners of the paper to open the floor and then leaving the final 7 minutes for your reaction if you agree. So as to collect more inputs and questions as well. So I open the floor. So Killian, you're raising a hand. Would you like to intervene? Yeah, please keep it short so as to collect many. Okay.
Very, very short. I just understood that you had no BO data and offshore jurisdiction as risk indicators, and I wondered whether you also tried to combine that. So there is no BO data, but you know that the BO must be in an offshore jurisdiction because you queried that with all of the company registers of the companies involved in the hierarchy of the company group. That's something that Christoph Trautvetter did from the German Tax Justice Network and found out that it's the case for around 10% of all companies in Germany owning real estate, so quite a high number. And I think maybe these companies are even riskier than those who just don't have BO data.
Thank you. More questions, comments? I have one, but I leave the other before. Irene? No? Sorry. Yeah. No, if there is no other one, just two brief comments. So one, what was surprising me was the percentage of bids with BO, that the lowest percentage is in Denmark and in the United Kingdom. And I'm guessing why this is the case. If it is because you said that there are very big multinational companies with no BOs or for other reason. So if you have tried to understand why this is the case. And the other is whether you checked if the BO register also provides information on the structure and not just on the BO. So exactly on the intermediate layers, because as said by Kilian and by Andres as well, this is an information which could be employed, and this is something which we often suggested. So not just to include names of BOs in the register, but also how you control a firm. Antonina, yes. So I leave then to you guys for a reaction to this, to Andres, Kilian, and my question, and then we open again. Yeah.
Yes, hi all. I'm Antonina, and I have been working with all this data quite a lot period of time, and can talk a lot about all this stuff. So let me start with all this situation. Let's start firstly with technical data. Why we have this lower coverage in the UK and Denmark was caused because not all companies have their tax IDs in procurement data. Therefore, we have like the problem too much by company name. And for instance, in the UK, one company name can be used like different companies. And in some cases, company can say like, let's say London Ltd or London Limited, and this is the same company. But for the technical purposes, it's really hard to understand that this is the same company. So here is why we have like, in order to have this really good matching percentage, we need to have like these tax IDs for in both data sets, in beneficial ownership data sets and also in procurement data. This is first technical issue. The second technical issue, we have a lot of questions that we have like a company, we have owners, and we have beneficial owners. Not all countries provide information about this owner. For instance, Latvia, they provide information only about beneficial owner and not this like company registered in Cyprus, for instance, or in, let's say, Ukraine, owned by this Latvian company. So here is a problem that we don't have this like not all data sets contain this information. About different layers, I know that this is possible to do for the UK, but for instance, for Ukraine, unfortunately, it's not possible for right now because we have only the direct owner of the company. For, let's say, one company controlled by Rinat Akhmetov is owned by Cyprus company, but this Cyprus company can be owned like several layers, like 5-10 companies more. And usually when we try to rebuild corporate structure of these companies, as investigative journalists, it's usually takes like hours of works and just to build these 10 or 15 layers, because it's not only for hiding purposes, but also for tax optimization or like some managing different structures. So unfortunately, in not all data sets, it's possible. As the main challenge for like trying to combine that, it was data structure. Yes, we have been talking a lot about that data has to be really well structured, because in some cases you may have some spelling mistakes or some transliteration difficulties, or some typos even in register. So here's a situation when in Ukrainian register, the person was like typed by physically into the register, and it was like some spelling mistakes. So here it's really this structure will help to provide a much more clear results, more accurate, and to provide more interesting data. And here is the biggest challenge for us, how to identify that, for instance, when we have very popular name for Ukraine, or like Taras Shevchenko, let's say, that all these Taras Shevchenko are the same person. Okay, we can use address, but this person can change address, and this is not a unique identifier. I have a unique case when Ukrainian person became Israeli, and he changed not only his passport and nationality, but also his real name and surname. So for for the computer purposes and for machine learning type, it's two different persons. But actually, I see manually that this is the same person. And here, in order to make all these results very accurate, we need unique identifier, which will be used like not only in Ukraine, like for this exact person, but also in the UK, in France, in Latvia, that this person, that we can track this person internationally. Actually, it was really good that Estonia, I think, and Latvia partly provides this person ID number. Like we were able to use this as a unique identifier. But it's really good to have it in for all of countries. And what I want to say, if I'm not mistaken, I want to say this with private entrepreneurs. Why we remove them from the Ukrainian data set? Yes, from technically, it's like, okay, this private entrepreneur, sole owner, is like the person which really owns this company. But when we're talking about procurement data, usually this private entrepreneur is a worker of some bigger company, and this bigger company, honestly, a beneficial owner of this procurement data, but not this person. And in order to see this automatically, we need information about historical data, about his economic activity, like cause of economic activity. And for instance, if some sole owner just bids for some building purposes, like try to create some technical documentation, but in her or his economic activity cause mention some restaurants and hotels, it means that something wrong with this private entrepreneur. But here we are, unfortunately, don't have enough information to track all this stuff. So that's why we decided to remove all of them.
Okay.
The last point about political exposed person and what you mentioned about that, okay, if I'm a PEP and I can have a really good nominee owner, even if you provide someone as a nominee owner, you may forget and make a photo with them. And for investigative journalists, it really will be valuable information. They see, okay, you have some communication with some person and this person is an owner of 20 companies, and definitely these companies can belong to you. That's why, unfortunately, right now this PEP database is closed because of security issues, but we try to collect information not only about information about PEPs, but also about their close associates, family members, friends, students, like with whom they're talking a lot, or with some they like a support team, and usually they just register some companies on their support team or some trustees. So it's like when we're talking about PEPs, we have to talk, and we already discussed it with National Anti-Corruption Bureau team, okay, that they should understand not only PEPs but also their close family, close members. Yeah, I hear. Yeah. So sorry for taking so much time.
No, thank you, Antonina. I mean, this is sometimes a very technical topic, so you need to. Irene, Mishi, would you like to react to Andres and other comments? And I ask the other also to put questions somehow in the chat, maybe.
Yeah, just very quickly and responding to some of Andres and the people's comments. I think I love this topic because with beneficial ownership, you have data about persons, but also in connection with companies. And I think it has been discussed not only about the different levels of information that we have, but the different regulations and data quality according to the countries. And like Andres says, the different, what we understand as an outlier or something that is actually risky. And basically what I'm doing right now is identifying, like in all the literature, in expert cases, like saying, okay, what has been identified as a ownership risk indicator that we can analyze in the different countries, so we can test it to see if it's actually understanding something. But of course, like we said, this is going to be country dependent, but unless we say this can be used in this way and we don't have enough data to actually do this transnational analysis in certain countries, because in the UK we don't have the companies' names and then we have a problem, I think we cannot move the policy forward. And now that the 6th anti-money laundering is coming with this thing about saying that, oh, only people that have, the interest to actually have access to data sets. I think we are in a great time to talk about this, because we have to say how it's always sometimes journalists, NGOs, academia who are using these data sets to actually uncover the corruption, not only in one country, but in transnational. And that if we don't have enough quality data sets to understand, we won't be able to do so. I think also, like, we are corruption experts and anti-money, we know that they're going to be hiding. But even if they're hiding, we have to understand how they are hiding and how this actually sees in the data. Basically, because if we don't understand how we can see this in the data, then we cannot understand how to actually use this information for uncovering cases that could then go to other things. So I think we have to have a very broad saying of saying, okay, what has been identified in the literature in certain cases as risky, try to see in each country if it's working, then talking with the authorities in each country to see why we are seeing this difference. That is something that I'm doing right now to actually see, like you said, Andres, like why we are seeing in Estonia like so a big data quality compare, and also in Ukraine, and not compare with Denmark and UK, that you would be thinking they are like the persons that have the most transparency and the most usable data. So I think we have to also understand that this is like a mixed method approach of talking with a lot of people, understanding how this data can be used, but also, like you said, thinking about we move this policy forward, so we have more and more quality that can be used for certain identifications of different types of corruption, because this is just for public procurement. Like other instances of corruption, I think they have another set of ownership risk indicators that have also to be identified. And I'm going to give now the floor to Michi.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Andres, for your comments. I have been heavily looking down, taking notes on my paper. So especially the specific indicator suggestions, we will try some of them, which we can do. So super, thanks a lot. And also for the other comments. I want to pick up on just selected, because we have been received a lot of comments, and Irene and Antonina replied to many of them. So sophistication is an interesting one. I've been, I'm in this business of coming up with indicators for many years, and I've always been thinking about, are we just catching, the really unsophisticated ones and then giving the green card for the rest, right? So there's a risk there, but I agree with you that I think criminals, and even if they're not fully rational, they're to some degree rational, and evasion is costly, right? So setting up 10 layers of companies and hiding yourself behind them takes a lot of time, takes a lot of money. So if you are in Argentina and you can just wine and dine with the powerful and they will protect you from law enforcement, then that's what you're going to do, right? So I think Italy is on one end of the spectrum, a very corrupt country, but very sophisticated and independent law enforcement. In most other countries, corruption and captured law enforcement and courts go hand in hand. So I think indeed most countries have non-sophisticated corrupt. Yeah. So that's why I think simple indicators have a room, and I sincerely hope that no corrupt group is reading our paper, and we don't have many readers, so probably they don't. So, but I think transparency could be an issue, right? If there was a, I don't know, Latvian anti-corruption agency and starts to, target BOs of, 75 years plus, and 75 is their cut point for the risk factor, then indeed, there is this evasion from the corrupt, and they would start to use different nominees. So there is a risk there. But I think for the moment, some of these very simple indicators could work, and these correlations we uncovered exactly point at that. So I think, there is a point in, and we haven't met many sophisticated BO users in law enforcement. There are, and that's Irene's PhD, to find them and talk to them. But I think we need more, right? Because indeed we invested so much as a community in these data sets, and there are not many users, right? Even not that many countries who actually just know what's in these registers, I mean, there's a lot of, verification, case by case, but, these are data sets, and we need analysts to look at these and use them, and they're not that many. So we hope to kind of motivate some of them that there is a point in this, and they should use these data sets. The last thing I want to pick up on is your question on what data we would want. And of course, I want all the data in the world, but I think there is one surprising thing with this BO register, that in most countries we look that they have been set up as a silo, this is a BO register. It's not part of the company register. So when we wanted to get some company information in the UK, for example, that's sort of and yet another query in the API, yet another source to understand. So I think there is this problem of, yes, there is transparency on BOs, but legal owners are still intransparent in a lot of countries, or just even company registration date is transparent in some and intransparent in others. So I would want this generally company data, legal owners, beneficial owners, the sector of the company, these basic company data to be far more open. I think that would help to make better use of the BO data, and it would just, be a public good, I think. But we know there are vested interests in this company register, so not sure many people will listen to us, but I think this is something which would add a lot of value. Thank you again.
Yeah. Before passing to you, Antonina, are there any more comments from the floor? Question, inputs? Joras, yeah, please.
Yes, thank you. In this research, what you're doing is having these 6 countries side by side. But for me, it was always hard to understand what to infer from the differences that you find between the different countries. Because on the one side, you could say, yeah, the corruption schemes might be different, or in general, the crime situation might be different. But at the same time, we have that the data and the matching possibilities are so different. And then I never know really what is the driver between the differences that you find. And so I started to think about, okay, maybe looking within one country, trying to focus on one country and see what is changing there. And you have a figure in your paper, which you didn't show in your presentation, where you show the development over time within every country. But also there, I was quite puzzled. I saw that in the graph that Latvia went from basically 0 risky frequency to about 10% in a couple of years, which is a huge increase that we don't see in other countries, where I'm also doubting, is the crime situation completely changing, or is there something with the data?
So this is a great question, and we deliberately don't want to have cross-country benchmarking rankings. So these are similar methods, similar data, but country by country analysis, and even like missing some the BO age is not recorded in every country, so we really cannot compare countries. But I put the chart in the chat. The changes in the countries, that's interesting. And again, we don't know why, but these are hard numbers, right? So literally, when it goes up, it means there are more companies on, the names of BOs with a lot of companies, so on and so forth. So these are factual big changes, and we don't know what drives them. But it's great that you mentioned, because one of the inspirations for our paper is actually your paper. When you look at the policy change, announcing anti-money laundering policy and how ownership changes, because you can do a similar thing in procurement data. You see the BO policy, and we have procurement data before and after, right? So sort of we have the indicators, at least some of them, which we think are valid, and we want to use them for exactly these sorts of research. And this is where the trends become interesting, like what drives these changes within country. I'm not a big fan of cross-country research in this domain, but within country changes, I think we should start to unpack them once we, have some handle on the indicators which we think are valid.
Maybe I will start.
Yeah, please.
Yes. Yeah. So sorry for jumping. Maybe I'll start with also this historical change, country by country. It can, yes, in our paper we haven't analyzed it a lot. But I did for Ukraine, because it's like we have been monitoring procurement for the last 10 years, and we were like beneficial ownership register. It's like our child. That's why we're still fighting for it. So it's like, in developing countries, any political change, it can cause like significant ups and downs in anti-corruption or corrupt topics. So here, and also when when we have this like political background changes, we have like some reforms they start like doing more actively, and another one like are decreasing, have some decreasing points. So here is why we have this ups and downs in all these countries. And for instance, when we're talking about BOH, we have the slides with the elder people, that elder people are risky for like post-Soviet countries, and it's also a risk for Ukraine. But for instance, for the UK, it's like we have youngest. Younger people can be risky, so it's like here, you know, it also can be depend for countries. Yeah, and I want to say like very shortly with jumping to previous comments with corrupt people who usually monitoring all this stuff. You know, all corrupt people are reading our papers and our materials in Ukraine, and they try to change their behavior in order not to be caught, but they usually do some mistakes. They use the same nominee twice, or they forget to change the address, they forget to change the phone number, and you start catching like all these tiny moments, and to see that several companies are connected to one group. They can have like different beneficial owners, they can have like different histories even. But here you need, that's why you need more data like to catch all these like differences and changes. And even what we see is that even when corrupt people know everything, they still make mistakes. And here, that's why open data doesn't provide any riskiness for law enforcement to investigate all these cases. Even more, they have like more resources to see these mistakes and to catch these guys. That's why it's like it's only explanation that okay, all this data can be risky, but actually it's not. And it can be, and even if you are a good owner, it can save you from corrupt people. Yeah, thank you.
Just very quickly, Michele, before we close. So basically, so you know, and this is something I'm going to do for my own interest. Right now, I'm trying to interview people in these 6 countries to understand the difference we're seeing in the risk indicators. So I'm going to leave my email. If you know someone that I could reach out in the 6 different countries that I can interview, it would be super helpful, or other cases that we can actually identify, because like we said, we're doing a database about what has been written, what can we analyze with this data, and what we can match it to identify different risk, ownership risks, patterns with different kinds of signs of corruption would be super useful. So thank you.
Absolutely, we will do, and share also within this network if useful. No, thank you indeed for this very good discussion. I think, yes, as we said, beneficial ownership transparency has been a central issue, but for understanding if it is working or has worked as a measure of anti-money laundering and transparency, we need absolutely to understand better the data behind the tools, how they work, and their implications in various domains, including public procurement, but not only. And I think this paper was exactly an example of a starting point for this kind of assessment. So thank you indeed, and see you then January and February for the next webinars. Bye-bye. Thank you, the presenters. Ciao.